There we go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for this month's episode of Evidence-Based Esports. Once again, I am joined by HP for Gamers. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me again.
All right, always glad to have you back. This month's topic is talking about tendon injuries because they are pretty gosh darn prevalent. Kind of the shorthand that everybody uses is I have a tendinitis, which you might see us laughing because that term gives a little bit of the heebie-jeebies because an itis is technically an inflammation, which is not necessarily what everybody has. So we're kind of going to go over a bit about what kind of tendon injuries there are, what the most common ones are, and then what we do about them. So this is a bit more of like an informational session than it is just a breakdown of a recent research piece. But we figured it was a useful thing to start with, and at some point in the near and or far future, we can probably do something fun with talking more about tendon issues. And I just switched overlays for a brief second there. Sorry, guys. All right, so we're going to start out with what is a tendon, because that's a fairly important thing to consider in the first place. A tendon is what connects a muscle to a bone. It's a transmitter of force. It's designed for durability more than flexibility, though it does have to have some flexibility as well. So a tendon is what makes sure that when your muscle contracts way up here in your forearm, your finger moves way down here in your hand. Simple things like that. So there's three major kinds of tendon injuries. There's tendinitis, which is the traditional one that we use as a catch-all for everything. Itis is inflammation, so a tendinitis is an inflammation of the tendon. That's not necessarily always a bad thing. Inflammation can be good. Inflammation is useful. There's a reason your body does it. Inflammation is bad when it sticks around too long, is a really basic sum up. Then you got a tenosynovitis, which is inflammation of a sheath that surrounds the tendon and helps it glide over bony prominences, make sure it doesn't get stuck, so to speak. And then last but not least, and the primary focus of at least the article that I was focusing on, is a tendinosis. And a tendinosis is a failed healing response of a degenerated tendon. So it's less about inflammation, more about it never got past that. So generally speaking, when you have an injury, things are supposed to regenerate over time. Your body is supposed to fix itself. That's what it's designed to do. Your body is, however, an imperfect system. So a tendinosis occurs when the cells that are supposed to regenerate in a particular pattern go out of pattern. You get things like scar tissue, you get decreased vascularization, which is decreased blood flow to an area that's supposed to have blood flow. You get cells that weren't designed to bear loads. Tenocytes are the cells that are supposed to bear loads. They are the cells that make up new tendons. But instead, sometimes you'll get things like you'll get non-collagenous tissue. Collagen is the basic structure that we're going to be using to talk about that makes up the tendon. So when we get those things that aren't supposed to be in the tendon or aren't supposed to be in that direction, that's generally a tendinosis. The tendon not healing the way it's supposed to. So a tendinosis is caused by repetitive microtrauma. So repetitive stress injuries, which you guys are all familiar with. And then usually those repetitive stresses are applied in a bad position, in a suboptimal position. So, my usual rant about bad ergonomics comes to mind. So those repetitive microtraumas, those repetitive stresses in a bad position, they gradually weaken the collagen fibers that give tendons their strength and their mobility and their flexibility. Those repetitive microtraumas cause things to regenerate in abnormal patterns that disrupt the normal lengthwise motion and progression and structure of a tendon. And once that starts to happen, once that cycle gets started, you can treat the symptoms of pain all you want, but if you don't change the root cause, nothing is fixed. Tendinoses are likely to recur because A, we don't like changing and we're bad at it, and B, the more it goes on, the weaker the tendon becomes, the more prone it is to be injured over again, and again. So, just like we harped on last time, treating the cause is every bit as important as managing the symptoms, and probably more so. So the hallmarks of a tendinosis would be, it's worst with when you start your activity. It does build up over time. It's a repetitive stress injury, so obviously it builds up over time. But you'll notice the pain or the stiffness most prominently upon initiation of activity or upon waking up. and the pain will improve to some extent after warm-up. It's kind of like a bell curve, right? You'll get the really bad pain right when you start out, and then it'll kind of improve a little bit, and then it'll get really bad again over time. You'll also feel the pain right over the injured spot, which is really convenient, and ultrasound imaging shows us that there's a pretty high correlation between the perception of pain, like a pinpoint spot, and what ultrasound imaging can show us of where the injury is occurring. So the traditional conservative management is ice, rest, mobilization, and anti-inflammatories. And we are currently batting about 75% there. Rest, ice, and mobilization are shown to still be good. Anti-inflammatories we are questionable on. So let's break those down one by one. Starting out with rest. Traditionally, when you hear rest as a gamer, you probably think, nobody's going to tell me that I'm not allowed to play my video games. Don't you dare tell me I have to step away from my computer completely. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to listen to you. You don't know what you're talking about. Rest does not mean avoiding all activity. I'm going to say it again because it's important. Rest does not mean not doing literally everything. Rest means modifying your activity. Rest means changing your mechanics if they're bad. It means decreasing repetitive motions in a stressful position. It means complementing it with early mobility. It doesn't mean stop doing literally everything. It means change what you're doing. And yes, decrease it to an extent, but it doesn't mean you can't do shit.
Yes.
So you complement that rest with exercise. Early mobility is shown to improve outcomes. It complements the rest of the tendon. So right, you're resting it from the things that are causing it stress, and you're involving it in things that will strengthen it. So you limit the repetitive motion. You take those motions out of the equation, and you add in motions that strengthen the areas that have been broken down. And generally, the best practice would be to involve eccentric exercises and combine them with static stretches. So an eccentric exercise would be, for example, a pull-up has a concentric and an eccentric component. There's the pulling up portion. That's concentric. That's when the muscle is shortening as it is contracting. And then you have the eccentric portion, which is you are lowering back down. So you are actively lengthening the muscle, but it's still contracting at the same time. That's the eccentric portion. So an eccentric exercise would be the lowering phase of the pull-up. And then static stretches are things like what we showed you last week with, here's, hold your hand like this for 30 seconds at a time kind of deal. So you want to be doing both of those things. You want to be lengthening the muscle, lengthening the tendon, moving in that direction of stretching out, both while stretching it passively and while strengthening it actively. Exercises aren't necessarily going to be painless. There's a likelihood that there will be pain at the beginning of the exercises. In the long term, they may provide some pain relieving effects, but yeah, they're not going to be pain-free. If your exercises are not pain-free, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. It may mean it if it is a new pain or a sharp pain or a pain that doesn't resolve, but it's not inherently bad to feel some pain or extra stress with these new exercises that you add in. And what research shows us is that there's a minimum 12-week regimen of exercises for optimal recovery, and then you move into the maintenance phase of the exercises. So this is not a short-term thing. The time component is pretty gosh darn big. It takes several weeks, even months, for full healing to occur. So jumping back into those repetitive motions too early is likely to undo the progress you've started to make. So it's a very important balance, and you got to consider what we talked about last time, that return to play idea of you don't just jump straight back into sprinting if you tore your hamstring. You progress your way back. Same thing goes for tendon injuries. You build up gradually. And then the other component that we mentioned was icing. Icing is good. Icing's great. Ice does reduce inflammation, whether or not there's inflammation involved in the tendon injury. Ice also reduces pain, which is fairly useful. And there's also research that suggests that ice can maintain oxygen saturation by decreasing capillary blood flow at the surface, which is especially important early on because all of your bodily structures need blood flow to get them the nutrients they need to recover. So we talked about what to do when it comes to recovery. Rest complemented with exercise, ice, and time. Let's talk a little bit about what not to do. So the research is a little more questionable on the benefits of injections and anti-inflammatory medications. Traditionally, those are involved in the treatment of tendon injuries. However, what the research shows us is using things like corticosteroids, short term, they can decrease pain, but in the long term, the effects may be more harmful than beneficial. They can cause further degeneration or weakness of the tendon. Another common injection that's suggested is platelet-rich plasma, or PRP. The research shows that's no better than a placebo. It doesn't particularly do much of anything. So it won't actively harm you, but it doesn't do much to help you. So don't stick a needle in yourself if you don't need to. And last but not least, when it comes to non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, things like your Advils and your aspirins and your Motrins and your Aleve, all of those, the research is out still on whether or not they are helpful or harmful or at all impactful in tendon healing. They're known to have a detrimental effect on bone healing. They do reduce pain, but we're not sure what they do or don't do in terms of tendon healing. So it's not within our practice act to say you should or should not take anti-inflammatories. We're just giving you what the research says. And we already have a question in chat. Is it possible to strengthen a tendon like your bones? So if I'm interpreting your question correctly, I'm thinking you're kind of talking about how your bone adapts to the stress that's placed on it. So right, you might see people with knee injuries that are fairly common in younger runners because they place too much stress on a certain structure right below their knee before that bone has time to fully adapt to the amount of stress that's being placed on it. So yes, bones will adapt to the stress that's placed on them. Any bodily structure will. So yes, it is possible to strengthen a tendon. I'm not sure what you mean by like your bones exactly, but yes, it's possible to strengthen a tendon and the muscle it's attached to and the bone it's attached to. Hey, everything can get stronger. That's great.
I think one important thing to add on to that is also that it just depends on the time component. Every tissue in the body has different amount of blood supply to it, which affects how quickly the tissue, tendon, bone, muscle, how quickly it heals. So bone heals a lot more slower than something like a tendon. A ligament and tendon heal more slowly than a muscle. So yes, it can adapt. It's just a different amount of time that it takes to adapt. But sorry, go on.
No, that was good. That was actually a really good segue for you to jump into yours, if you want to.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So basically, I looked at two sort of overall studies that kind of summarize the current understanding of what tendinopathy and tendon injuries are. And I'll touch a little bit about the same topics that you went over, but I want to kind of take the most important takeaways from what I read. So again, just like you said, a brief review of the function of the tendons, and that, they're meant to transmit forces from the muscle to the bone. And just a little more about the physiology of the tendon. They have both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, meaning they either use oxygen or not, and that allows them to carry loads and maintain tension for a really, really long time. So they, again, have a slower metabolic rate, meaning, which is what I touched on earlier, in that a ligament and a tendon heals more slowly than a muscle because there's less blood supply to it. So that's important to realize in what also, with what Kaylin said, in that healing for tendon injuries can take a long time. And in the studies that I looked at, and in sort of the update of our understanding of tendons, the typical healing frame or timeline is after an initial injury, and let's say in esports, our injury gets developed as we use our tendons more and more, and eventually until they become strained. After it becomes strained, there's a acute sort of inflammation phase that lasts for about 24 hours, and that's where we need inflammation. That's where Kaylin had mentioned that it's important part of our natural healing process, and we need it to progress the tissue along this timeline of healing. And the second phase, after the 24 hours, all the way up until 6 weeks, is called the proliferative phase, and this is where the tissue begins to build a little more. And after 6 weeks, there's a remodeling phase. So from 6 to 10, the the tissue changes from a little more cellular to fibrous and thickens. And from there, it even gets a little more stronger and all the way up into a year. So tendons, to get their previous level of strength, can take all the way up to a year. But that doesn't mean that the pain won't go away beforehand,
Hmm.
which is why it's really important for us to understand that.
Right.
We can continue to do all of our activity and say, hey, well, we don't have any more pain, but we're still along this timeline of healing. And if we don't modify our activity, like Caitlin mentioned, then we often find ourselves back along earlier in the timeline or injuring our tendons again.
Right.
So
The good news about um, tendon healing is that it's. I just completely lost my train of thought. Never mind. You carry on. Good lord. I actually just had a complete and total brain fart. We're gonna
no
blame the lack
worries.
of coffee, and you're just gonna
Yeah,
carry
no
on.
worries. Yeah, so I mean, touching a little further on that, I mean, because esports pain is a result of, again, repeated strain, and typically it's not an acute strain or a tear from dynamic activities, because we're not doing really crazy things. We're just sitting there and mashing our keyboard. I mean,
Oh wait, there's a
yeah,
thought. I
maybe in a
remembered
clutch
it.
situation.
All right.
Oh,
So
yeah,
you were
go ahead.
talking about the importance of pain and recognizing the role that that has in your recovery cycle as well. All right. The great thing about pain is that it tells us when we are about to fuck things up. The bad thing about pain is eventually it goes away and we may still be fucking things up. So it's important to
Right.
recognize that just because you are not feeling pain anymore doesn't mean that your body isn't still undergoing those stresses. So you need to keep an eye on your timeline. You need to keep in touch with whoever's kind of supervising your recovery program. And remember that just because it doesn't hurt right now in this moment doesn't mean that you're not applying stress that may hurt later.
Exactly. So don't use pain as a measure for your tissue condition.
Right. It's not the
To,
sole indicator. It can help,
yeah,
but it's not the only one.
exactly. I mean, that's basically one of the biggest things from this study is that, yeah, I mean, we can't really use pain as a clinical measure because we understand healing times of tendon injuries. Um, Typically in 3 to 4 weeks, if it's properly managed with a lot of the activity modifications that you suggested, changing your mechanics, improving your movement, working on strengthening within a reasonable amount of stress, it can go away. But that just means uh, we just have to approach it in the same way that you had mentioned in terms of graded exposure. We
Right.
just have to allow the tendon to experience just the right amount of stress so that it can build instead of break down.
Right. Yeah, you were touching on that remodeling phase, which is really key, especially because we were talking about the how one of the issues with tendinosis is that the remodeling occurs incorrectly. So that's one of those phases that it's really important to focus on the appropriate complementary exercises and the appropriate movement patterns, right? Because we need to train that tendon to heal in the right pattern, so to speak.
Exactly, exactly. So the study kind of goes into some of the biomechanics of tendons, and basically it responds in a stress strain sort of pattern, I guess a curved pattern. And um, what we really have to only understand is that tendons are at a risk for injury from two major things: the load itself, so how much actual weight or force we're putting onto the tendon, as well as the rate and frequency of loading, so how often we're utilizing the tendon. So because esports involves lower loads but higher frequency and speed of movement, these are the things that we have to really consider when we want to more or less prevent injury or even address injury. So going again into the treatment part of it, if we want to look at what are some of the contributing factors of the pain or of the strain of the tendon, we should try to limit the death grip or mashing your keys super hard when during like a clutch situation or a team fight, and because that can really create or increase your risk of injury.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's pain, that's definitely again the warning sign that you might mess something up. And on the second component, that rate and frequency of loading, that's the more common cause of injury is in itself, right? Because we are sitting for the extended period of time, typing and moving at typically a higher APM than your regular sedentary job, which already has its host of hand injuries. So that's why it's really important for us to
Mm-hmm.
pay attention to how long we're doing things and having the right plan beforehand to prevent the strain from actually occurring.
Right, and a really good example of what you're talking about with the rate and the frequency of the load being really big contributing factors in gaming is, look at melee, look at the amount of stress or discomfort or even pain that players report with playing floaties like Peach versus playing Fox. Um, Pretty much every Fox player I've come across, or everyone who has a reasonably good high level Fox, has at one point or another said, "Wow, my hands are so much tighter. This muscle is so much, more stress. Like my hands are painful here. Like, yeah, when you are applying a very rapid force over a very long period of time, then yeah, absolutely, that frequency and that rate of loading is the key factor in play."
Right. And in a way to describe how it actually can get injured, we all we have to think about is that physical stress theory that I had mentioned before, in that, our body responds to stress in two ways. It can either build up after the stress or break
Break
down.
down.
And yeah, and that's one lens to look at it, in the lens of pure mechanics.
Mhm.
But the other lens is again from healing, right? It breaks down at a certain rate in response to stress, and it also builds at a certain rate in response to stress. So if we don't give it time to repair, it's going to create abnormal stress in the tendons, and that will cause some fibers within the tendon to be strained more. And this was kind of a really interesting concept that I read in the JOSPT update, the concept of stress shielding. Have you heard about that before?
I have a little bit.
Oh yeah, so it's pretty cool, but basically it's the idea that because some fibers are damaged and they become pulled apart and strained, the other fibers take more load in response, of course, and but it's naturally shunted to the other fibers, and that creates abnormal stress in those tendons and leads to increased amounts of or increased risk rather of
Right.
injury. Yeah, and as a result of that, more on the physiological side, the pain response that's caused is relating to the inflammatory mediators. So, in this JOSPT update, they said that even in tendinosis, there is evidence of some inflammation.
Hmm.
Yes, there's that the first 24 hours, but
Right.
they also believe that it's may be related to paratendinitis, which is more on the most
Right. Those
outer
surrounding
sheath.
structures.
Yeah, the most outer sheath of that tendon, and that's where some of this inflammation continues to be present. And that's kind of why we refer more to tendon injuries as tendinopathy instead of tendinitis.
Right, and
Because,
just as for anybody who doesn't have a classical Latin background, an opathy is a pathology or an injury or a something wrong with this thing. So a tendinopathy is a something wrong with a tendon, as
yeah,
opposed to a tendinitis, which is more specifically it is an inflammation of the tendon. So tendinopathy kind of just encompasses all these injuries at the same time.
right. So what's interesting was that the cause of the pain, they attributed it to some of these inflammatory chemicals that were released into that area called substance P, some prostaglandin E2, and when there's a tendon that's repeatedly strained over and over and over, our bodies respond to that by upregulating some of the detectors of pain. So it makes it even more sensitive, which is why sometimes over time, with when we are dealing with these injuries for a really, really long time, the tissues may have already healed, but less stress on, or
It
yeah,
takes
less
less
stress.
stress.
Yeah, exactly. It will take less stress. The threshold for pain is much lower, even though the tendon is healed, and it's relating to this increase of receptors or detectors of pain, which is unfortunate. but but
Right. So
that's
that does tie back into what you were talking about, though, about how pain can't be your sole guide as to whether you are or are not recovered. It's definitely a useful indicator, and it's kind of part of your toolkit of telling what's going on with your body, but it can't be the sole thing you're paying attention to, because pain lies. Sometimes when you're doing exercises to make yourself stronger as a complement to the rest you're doing, you're going to have discomfort. And it's not going to be because you're actively injuring yourself. And sometimes when you've been progressing through your exercises and you've reached, that 10-week out point and you don't hurt anymore, you think that you're fine to go, and that doesn't mean that you're completely 100% all settled again. So please don't use pain as your only indicator, guys.
Yep. So, and that's for the most part basically the current, I guess, evidence on all the details of tendon and the pathophys, or the, I guess, how the tendon gets injured. Mm-hmm. But basically, to kind of review on some of the things that you said with treatment, mm-hmm. and that, if we return a little too early, that's definitely a risk factor for it to get worse, or for you to feel that pain again, because the threshold is much lower for the pain response. But it's really important to realize, just as we always preach the posture, the ergonomics, all these potential changes in how you move, you're a lot weaker when you have an injury. These are the things that after your tendon has already healed and you've rested and changed what you've done, you have to address these. We have to restore your HP essentially on each of these things. How you move, we got to get that back. Because a lot of the times when you have an injury in, let's say, a tendon here, and this guy doesn't move as well, in order to help it move, you start to move your wrist. And that's what we call movement impairment. So that changes everything, all your mechanics, and that leads to stress elsewhere, which is why one injury can often lead to another, which can often lead to another, which is why it's also super important for you to seek out the medical attention when necessary if you're doing things that aren't helping you with the pain. If when you follow some of our suggestions or read some of the things that we provide online and it's not getting better, we can't provide our eyes on articles to actually tell you how to move better.
Right. So the thing that's a really important caveat to give out, because we give this information because it's kind of the useful, the basics, the things that you should have in your own toolkit. That doesn't mean it's the be-all and end-all and the how to fix all of your pain. It's here's what you try first. If this isn't working, this is when you go see an actual professional in person. So if you ever ask us a question, and our response is, let me refer you to someone in person, we're not trying to brush you off. We're not trying to say we don't know. That may be the case, though. But what we're trying to say is we can only know this having only talked to you online. We can't know X, Y, and Z without seeing how you move in person. We unfortunately have not developed teleportation or psychic powers yet, working on it. But for right now, remember that everything that's presented here is kind of... Don't tell them about our diabolical plots. But for now, remember that everything that's presented here is kind of just like, here's the basic toolkit. Here's what you start with. It's not what you end with necessarily.
Yeah, and this is definitely something we can touch on in the future in terms of the general framework of how we approach treatment and how we can give you guys a really easy toolkit to look at how you can approach any of your injuries. And in the very basic sense, there are really only a few major contributors that cause pain. There's mobility, which is like how flexible your muscles are. There's power, which is the strength in your muscles. And then 3, there's the movement part of it, your motor coordination and the movement impairment that I had mentioned. Those are really 3 big categories on things that we look at first to address or get you back to where you're at before, and even look at it as a potential cause for why you developed this pain or injury to your tendons in the first place.
Right. So I think going back over, kind of just like to sum up, it's the last 5 minutes, so let's do the TLDR version of this.
Yes.
After this beautiful, glorious discussion of pathophysiology and all these, break it down 5 minutes. All right, 5 minutes. We got A tendon connects a bone and a muscle. We use tendinopathy to sum up all of the various kinds of injuries your tendon can have, because a tendinitis is just an inflammation and a tendinosis is just a failed healing response, so we want to cover it all. The reason that you get tendon injuries in the first place has to do with the rate and the frequency and the amount of the loads you place on it. Higher APM equals more stress. It also has to do with the pattern that you're moving in. Those are your movement patterns and your motor coordination. So the more motions in the worst position, the more likely you are to get an injury. You can't affect the injury in the long term if you don't address the root cause. You can reduce your pain, but you can't fix the problem unless you actually change what's causing it. So you need to change movement patterns. You may need to change how you load things. When you are treating a tendon injury, rest and ice and compression and elevation and all those things that they told you about in the race all still work. But the most important things to consider are that rest does not mean ignore all activity. Rest means decrease the stressful motions, increase ones that complement and strengthen the muscle, your eccentric motions and your static stretches. Early mobility is still key because as your tendon progresses through healing phases, one of the most important phases it hits after it kind of produces the new fibers is you need to remodel them into the right pattern. Remodeling in the wrong pattern just leads to more injury and more risk of injury. Ice is good. You should keep icing. You can ice for up to 20 minutes at a time and always put something between an ice pack and your skin. And we cannot recommend anti-inflammatories to you because we legally can't tell you whether or not to take them.
Yep, exactly. That was a good summary. I would say also in general, if you guys do have an injury and for somehow if you do get a diagnosis as a tendon injury, in 6 weeks, it should be significantly better if you manage it based on everything that we had just suggested, even 3 to 4 weeks, because most of you guys are probably really young. So
yep, your pain should definitely have improved within 3 to 4 weeks if you're following what you're supposed to be doing for it. If it hasn't improved within 3 to 4 weeks, then you need to revisit what you're doing because it may not actually be working. And also, and last but not least, because you touched on this and it was very important, keep in mind that pain is not the be-all, end-all indicator of your health and your fitness. There will be times when things that are good for you hurt, like exercises. There will be times when things that are bad for you don't hurt, like bad movement patterns 10 weeks out from getting started on a recovery program. So use the pain as one indicator, but don't use it as your be-all, end-all. Remember that there's a whole lot more to your body than just its ability to sense pain.
Exactly. And just as you said with the eccentric stretching or eccentric exercise, I would use on a 0 to 10 scale. If it's a 3 out of 10 and it's achy, that's okay.
Yep.
If it's anything more than that and it becomes sharp, I would stop and try to modify what you're doing to
good guideline.
more appropriately. Yeah.
And so what are some things that we can do to change an exercise that may be overly stressful? We can change the load on it. Change how much weight you're moving. You can change how much range of motion you're going through. As opposed to bringing your wrist all the way back as far as it possibly goes, maybe you only bring it back to 45 and gradually progress to moving all the way through the range of motion.
We can also change the amount that we're doing.
Reps and sets.
Yeah.
How often you do it, how much rest time you take in between the exercises, things like that. Got another question in chat. When do you recommend heat versus ice when treating something not just with tendinitis? I think we mentioned this one last week, but I'll say it again because it's an important one. Both heat and ice can reduce pain, which is awesome. However, generally speaking, ice is for inflammation, heat is for muscle tension. Ice reduces blood flow to an area. It reduces some of those inflammatory factors. Heat increases blood flow to an area. So if an area is already inflamed and full of fluid, you don't want to bring more blood flow to it, generally speaking. You want to clear things out. So really, really generally would be ice for inflammation, heat for muscle tension.
Yeah, and I've also had some positive results from doing contrast.
Contrast baths are great.
Yeah, especially if it's in the first week or so and it's still kind of in the inflammatory phase, you can pretty much not have as much blood flow to the area, reduce some of the inflammation, and then facilitate better healing by bringing more blood to the area.
Because we do want blood flow in there for repair. We just also don't want inflammatory factors in there. So we need to kind of do an exchange, I guess. We've got another question. Now that we're in cold weather, are there negative consequences from washing hands in warm water to get them to room temperature? I'm afraid that the sudden change in temperature could be harmful. Could this increase the chance for injury? I mean, if you got full-blown frostbite, don't stick your hands under boiling water. But if you are gradually if you're really cold outside and you run your hands under some nice lukewarm water to get your body temperature back up, there's nothing wrong with that. That won't increase your risk for injury. I mean, obviously, don't play on cold hands. That's a bad life choice. Let your hands do some warming up, and hey, maybe you could use washing your hands in warm water and then doing those lovely hand exercises we talked about last week. Those are all. It's actually, you're not going to injure yourself by warming your hands up with warm water, though.
Yeah, and it's actually one thing that I've started to test in terms of, just as we in regular sports, if we do warm-ups for our hands, can it improve performance? And so far, with some of the players that I worked with, they've responded positively to it. So it's worth, one, warming up by doing actual exercises like this maybe. And I also have another league player that I've worked with that I actually have him because he lives in an area that's really cold just to warm up his hands and then do the exercises. So both have really had positive results in how they felt they could control their actual mechanical skill in the game, which is really cool to see. So I would recommend that regardless. Warm up.
Warm up for sure. That's a good takeaway from that. Absolutely warm up. Just don't stick frostbitten hands in boiling water. That's not good. Don't do that.
Please don't.
All right. I think that is about all the questions we've got, and I think that's covered all of the information we had. Thank you guys for tuning in. This was kind of our very general overview of tendon injuries. Maybe somewhere down the line we'll be doing a little bit more on that because it's a pretty big topic for gaming. Until next time, we'll be seeing you in about a month for some more evidence-based esports.
Yep.